There is a tomb on a red planet at the edge of explored space, and the stone above its door is still warm. Not warm from the sun, not warm from any fire. The air around it is dry and cold, the way desert air gets at night when nothing is left to hold the heat. But the stone above that sealed door stays warm to the touch, even in the dark, even after months. Nobody who found it later could explain why. The inscription carved into the rock above the entrance uses a word that has no translation in any Republic language. The closest meaning anyone ever found for it was this: the silence left behind when a question finally stops being asked. Nobody knew whose tomb it was. Nobody knew what question had stopped being asked inside it. The Republic fleet that passed through this valley sealed every door they could find and left without looking deeper. They had won the war. They were ready to go home. The details could wait for scholars who came later. The scholars came later. And what they found inside that valley changed everything they thought they understood about how the Jedi Order had broken and what had grown from the break. This is that story, and it does not start with a battle. It does not start with a prophecy or a weapon or a great evil rising from somewhere dark. It starts with a room, a circle of chairs, a vote that 12 people believed was the right thing to do. They were not wrong. That is the part that takes the longest to understand. They were not wrong, and what they did still produced 100 years of war, a dead planet full of warm tombs, and an order built on darkness that the galaxy would not finish fighting for another 3,000 years. Welcome. This is the entire 100-year darkness timeline, from the last session of the Jedi High Council's Great Hearing to the founding of the first true Sith Empire. Take your time. Get comfortable. Every piece of this connects. By the end, you will understand the warm stone. Now go back, 103 years before that sealed door, Coruscant, 7,003 years before the Battle of Yavin. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant was built on the highest natural ground the planet had left. Every structure around it had been constructed on top of older structures, layer after layer, until the original surface was buried so deep that nobody alive had ever seen it. But the temple sat on bedrock, solid, unchanged. The masters who designed it believed that the order needed a foundation that nothing could move. The chamber on the 143rd floor had 12 seats arranged in a circle. That number had not changed in over 1,000 years. 12 seats, 12 votes. And on this particular morning, 8 of those seats were occupied. The other 4 were empty because the masters who sat in them were dead. They had been killed in the conflict that brought this hearing about. A series of engagements that the Order's records called the Battles of the Legions of Letau, and that ordinary soldiers and temple guards who had survived them called something shorter and less formal. They called them the worst months of their lives. A man stood in the center of the circle. His name was Ajunta Pal. He was 44 years old. He had served the Order for 31 years, trained 2 students from Padawan to full knight, and written a paper on force channeling that was reproduced in every temple library across the Republic. He was not a violent man by nature. The lightsaber at his belt had been used in combat exactly 3 times in his career before the Legions of Letau conflict began. He was, by almost any measure, a scholar who happened to be a warrior rather than the other way around. He had been standing in this circle for 3 hours. The vote had been taken in the first hour. It had not changed. He already understood it was not going to change. What he was doing now, what he had been doing for the 2 hours since the tally was read aloud, was something harder to name. He was not arguing. The time for argument had passed. He was not pleading. Ajunta Pal had not been built for pleading, and he was not going to learn the skill at 44. He was simply standing, waiting, giving the council one more chance to explain itself in terms he could carry with him. They had cast him out. What he wanted was to understand why. The man who had started all of this was already dead. His name had been Zender, and he was the one who had asked the question that split the order, not through violence, not through defection, but through a paper, a formal academic argument submitted to the Council's Philosophical Review Board. The argument was this: the dark side of the Force was not an enemy to be resisted. It was a current, a natural direction of flow in the energy that connected all living things. To refuse the dark side entirely was not discipline, it was fear. And fear, Xender had written, was not something an order devoted to truth should build its entire philosophy around. The council had rejected the argument. Standard procedure. Scholarly disagreement was not unusual inside the temple. Dozens of papers were submitted each year, pushing at the edges of established doctrine, and most of them were declined and filed and forgotten. Zender had not forgotten. He had spent the following years finding every Force sensitive in the Order who had privately wondered the same thing. Some of them were senior knights. A few held masterships. All of them had kept their doubts quiet for the same reason. Not because they believed the doubt was wrong, but because the culture of the Order had made it clear that certain questions were unwelcome. You could ask them once. You could not build a career around asking them. Zender built a movement instead. What followed was not a clean ideological split. It was messier than that. Supporters of Zender's position clashed with temple security. Formal hearings were called and then collapsed. Members of the Order who had never agreed with Zender still felt the council was handling the situation badly. Too rigid, too quick to treat inquiry as threat. Then the first deaths happened, and after the first deaths everything accelerated. And by the time the formal fighting ended, Zender himself was gone, killed in one of the final engagements in a way that the Order's official records described in 4 flat sentences and did not return to. The idea survived him. It always does. Ajunta Pal had not been one of Zender's inner circle. He had read the original paper. He had found parts of it convincing and parts of it careless, which was an honest assessment. What had pulled him into the conflict was not devotion to Zender's thesis, but something more specific. A single session of the Council's emergency committee in which 3 senior masters had, in his presence, discussed the possibility of executing the core members of the movement rather than exiling them. The discussion had been framed as a question of efficiency, of galactic stability, of what the Order owed the Republic in terms of maintaining peace. Ajunta Pal had left that session and gone directly to find the others who had not yet chosen a side. What he said to them was simple. He said that an Order willing to discuss execution as a tool of doctrinal control had already lost the argument it claimed to be winning. That was the beginning. Now he stood in the circle, and the vote was done, and exile had been chosen over execution, which he understood was a mercy, and which he also understood was still a removal. They were not being reasoned with, they were being disposed of. "You believe you are being compassionate," he said to the 8 masters. His voice was level. He had not raised it once in 3 hours. "You believe that sending us away instead of killing us demonstrates restraint. I want you to understand something before I go." He paused, not for effect. He was simply choosing the right words. Zender's question never got an answer. You killed him before he finished asking it. Now you are removing everyone who heard it, and in 100 years, or 500, or 1,000, Another student in another temple library is going to stumble across the same observation and ask the same thing, and you will not have an answer then either, because you have never tried to find one. None of the 8 masters responded. The council head, a Togrutan woman named Var Thelian, who had served in that seat for 19 years and who would serve in it for 12 more, held his gaze for a long moment and then looked at the transcript recorder in the corner of the room. "The record will reflect," she said, "that the hearing has concluded. 2 floors below that chamber, in a room with no windows and very good lighting, the Jedi archivist was already working. His name is not recorded. He removed it himself before the session ended. The first act of erasure he performed that day was his own. What is known is his function. The Order maintained a master record of every being who had passed through the temple. Students enrolled, Padawans assigned, knights elevated, masters confirmed. The record was kept in 3 forms. Physical inscription on plates of a mineral compound that resisted decay for centuries, magnetic encoding on archive drives, and a verbal index recited by memory-trained archivists at each formal review. Removing a name from the physical plates took tools and time. The archivist had started on the physical plates the night before, working from a list of 43 names provided by the council's administrator. He had completed 11 before sunrise. He returned to the remaining 32 while the hearing was still in session above him. The tools made a quiet sound, a grinding, patient sound. Each name took between 4 and 7 minutes depending on how deeply it had been inscribed and how many cross-references linked it to other records. A name with 2 trained Padawans had more cross-references than a name with none. Ajunta Paul's entry took 11 minutes. When the inscription was gone, the stone looked unmarked, smooth, as if nothing had ever been written there at all. The exile fleet was 41 ships. Some were dedicated transport vessels. A few were lighter combat craft that had been involved in the legions of Letau engagements and had not been confiscated because they belonged to the exiles personally rather than to the temple. All of them were functional. None of them were new. Ajunta Pal was the last to board. He stood at the base of the landing ramp and looked up at the Coruscant skyline for a long time, the towers pressing upward, the transit lanes full of movement, the sky above them, the particular shade of orange-gray that the planet's upper atmosphere made at that hour. He had lived on this world for most of his adult life. He had walked those transit corridors 10,000 times. He knew the smell of the lower markets and the sound the temple made at night when the meditation halls were empty. He had no intention of returning. That was not stubbornness. It was the recognition of a fact. The Order had removed his name from the record. He was, officially, a person who had never been there. Going back would not change that. Going back would not make the Masters answer the question. Going back would not bring Zender out of the ground. He walked up the ramp. The door sealed behind him. The fleet cleared Coruscant's gravity, 4 hours later. In the deep part of the night cycle when the planet's surface was as close to dark as it ever got. From the viewport of the lead ship, the city planet shrank from a glowing mass to a bright point among other bright points. And then the jump to hyperspace took it away entirely. The stars elongated. The blue tunnel of faster-than-light travel swallowed the fleet whole. And in the corridor behind the cockpit, Ajunta Pal sat against the wall with his arms resting on his knees and stared at nothing in particular. He was not angry. That surprised him a little. He had expected to feel anger by this point. The way you expect a particular kind of weather, and then discover the temperature has gone somewhere else entirely. What he felt was closer to a kind of clarity, a settling. The argument was over. The question remained, and he had the rest of his life and an unknown amount of space to find a better answer than the one the council had given. He did not know yet where they were going. He did not know what they were going to become. He did not know that one day, on a red planet at the far edge of explored space, a room would be built around his name, a room with warm stone and an inscription that no Republic scholar would fully translate. He knew only that the fleet was moving, and Coruscant was gone, and somewhere ahead of them in the dark, the question was still waiting. Hyperspace does not feel like nothing. That is the first thing the chronicler wrote down after the fleet made its initial jump. She had expected emptiness. The blue tunnel of faster-than-light travel was familiar enough from missions during her years in the Order. But those earlier crossings had been short, days at most. The longest transit she had ever made as a Jedi was 11 days between systems in the expansion region, and even then she had been surrounded by other temple personnel, by routine, by the weight of an institution that pressed its shape onto every hour of every day, whether you wanted it to or not. This was different. She did not record her own name in the pages she kept. She recorded everyone else. Every conversation she overheard in the corridors, every argument that broke out in the cargo bays, every meal taken in silence at the long tables near the ship's center. Her own identity, she seemed to have decided, was not part of the document. What mattered was what the others did, what they became. She was the instrument of observation, not the subject. She wrote in the evenings, by the low light of a personal lamp clamped to the surface of her bunk. The stylus moved steadily. The pages filled. What she recorded in those first weeks was not drama. It was the texture of 41 ships full of people who had just lost the only life they had ever known, and who were not sure yet what to do with that loss. Ajunta Pal gave the fleet its first formal address 9 days into the crossing. He did not call it an address. He walked into the main communications bay of the lead ship, sat down in front of the transmission array, and opened a channel to every vessel in the formation. No ceremony, no prepared remarks. He spoke for approximately 12 minutes and covered 3 subjects. The first was navigation. They were moving toward the unknown regions, the vast, poorly charted territory beyond the edges of Republic space. He did not tell them exactly where they were going, because he did not know yet. What he told them was that they had enough fuel for a crossing of considerable distance, and that several members of the fleet with astronomical backgrounds had begun working on the problem of destination. That work was ongoing. It would produce results. The second subject was resources. The ships carried food stocks sufficient for roughly 4 months if rationed at current levels. Medical supplies were adequate. The one shortage of concern was mechanical. 3 of the smaller vessels had components that would require replacement within 60 days, and those components did not exist aboard the fleet. Solutions were being developed. The third subject was the Force. He said this without any particular emphasis, which was why it landed the way it did. He said that several members of the fleet had reported noticing something unusual about how the Force responded in deep space. He had noticed it himself. He did not have a full explanation yet. What he did have was this. The sensation being described was real. It was not a danger, and it was worth paying attention to. He invited anyone who wanted to discuss it formally to bring their observations to him, directly. Then he closed the channel and went back to his quarters. The chronicler, sitting at her bunk 3 decks below with her stylus already moving, wrote, "He did not tell them not to be afraid. He did not tell them everything would be fine. He told them what was true and what was being worked on and what was unknown. In 11 years inside the temple, I never heard a master address a group that way." The observation about the Force was not dramatic. It was subtle enough that several members of the fleet had initially dismissed it as fatigue or imagination, before realizing that too many people had described the same thing for it to be either. The Force in deep space felt closer. That was the phrase that kept appearing in the early accounts. Not stronger, not more powerful, closer, as if the usual distance between a person's awareness and the current of energy running through everything had narrowed. In the temple, using the Force required a kind of reach, an extension of attention outward toward something that existed slightly beyond the self. In deep space, mid-crossing, that reach shortened. The current was right there, right at the surface. Several of the older exiles found this unsettling. The distance, they said, had always functioned as a kind of steadiness, a gap between intention and action that gave you a moment to consider. With the gap reduced, intention and action sat directly next to each other. The thought of doing something and the capacity to do it were almost the same thing. Ajunta Pal found it clarifying. He had been experimenting since the third day, not on anything living. He had specific reasons for that restraint that he did not explain to the others yet. His subjects were materials, a section of corridor wall plating, a block of storage mineral from the cargo bay, a length of cable pulled from a non-essential system. He worked alone, in the small maintenance room adjacent to his quarters, with the door sealed. What he was attempting to do was change the structure of matter through deliberate force application, not by moving it, not by heating it through friction, but by reaching into the thing itself and persuading the arrangement of its components to become something different. The Jedi Order had studied this category of force use and had collectively decided it was an area of significant risk. The study of matter transformation through the Force touched on processes that, in the Order's view, required more control than most practitioners could reliably maintain. The formal term in temple scholarship was somatic alchemy. The informal view among senior masters was that it led to outcomes nobody could predict and fewer still could undo. Ajunta Pal had privately believed this risk assessment was accurate, but incomplete. The Order had treated unpredictability as a reason to stop. He had always suspected it was a reason to continue more carefully. On the 14th day of the crossing, he changed the molecular arrangement of a section of wall plating in a way that made it resistant to energy discharge. The change was stable. The plating held its new configuration for 72 hours before he deliberately returned it to its original state. He recorded the method. He kept the record in a format the chronicler would later copy into the formal archive. That archive became the first Sith text. Carnis Moore was 26 years old and had been a Jedi Knight for 3 years when the exile happened. He was tall, with the particular restlessness of someone whose mind moved faster than the situations available to him could satisfy. In the temple, he had been considered exceptionally gifted and intermittently difficult, the combination that senior masters recognized as either the profile of a future council member or the profile of a serious problem, depending on factors that only revealed themselves over time. He had sided with Zender's faction, not because he had been close to Zender personally, but because the argument had made immediate sense to him in a way that the opposing position never had. The Jedi Code asked him to suppress the parts of himself that moved most naturally. He had never been able to see how suppression improved anything. On the fleet, without the structure of temple hours and assignments, he moved faster. He began with insects. The ships carried a small population of them in the agricultural section. Several species used in the food production cycle, maintained in controlled containers. He took samples. He worked in a berth he had claimed in the mid-deck area, smaller than Ajunta Pal's maintenance room, but sufficient. His methods were rougher than the older man's, more intuitive, less systematic. He did not try to change molecular structure. He tried to reach inside the nervous system of a living thing and redirect it. The first attempts produced nothing useful. Several insects died in ways that were not instructive. He adjusted his approach. He stopped trying to impose a new structure and started instead trying to feel what structure was already present, what the creature's nervous system was already doing, what pathways it used naturally, and then simply extend those pathways in directions they had not gone before. On the 21st day, an insect responded to a force-generated signal by moving in a direction it had not been moving. Then it did it again. Then it continued doing it until he stopped generating the signal. He brought this result to Ajunta Pal that evening. The older man looked at the insect for a long time. He did not seem surprised. He asked two questions. How long had the responsiveness persisted after the signal stopped? And had there been any sign of damage to the creature's baseline function? Karnas answered both questions accurately. The responsiveness persisted for approximately 40 minutes. Baseline function appeared unaffected. Ajunta Pal said that this was promising, and that Karnas should continue, and that he should keep records of every attempt, whether it succeeded or not. Then he said something else, something that Karnas found harder to hold on to. He said, "Keep the subject small." Not for ethical reasons. He made this clear, unambiguously, without softening it. Not because the creature's suffering was the primary concern, but because understanding required scale. You learned to redirect an insect's nervous system before you tried to redirect something larger, the same way you learned to change a strip of metal before you tried to change the wall it was attached to. Ambition was not the problem. Sequence was, Karnas agreed. He returned to his berth and his insects. The chronicler wrote none of this down with any visible judgment. She recorded the conversation verbatim, the questions, the answers, the advice, and then added a single line below it. He told the young man that sequence mattered. He did not tell him that sequence had a destination. I wonder if he knows. On the 38th day, the first fracture opened. It had been building for some time. A group of 14 exiles, clustered across 3 of the smaller ships in the formation, had been developing a private position on the direction of the crossing. They were not opposed to the unknown regions as a destination. Their objection was to Ajunta Pal's authority to make that choice for all 41 ships without a formal vote. The complaint was, on its surface, procedural. But procedures are always about something else. What the 14 were really saying was that the coalition that had formed during the Legions of Letau conflict had been built around opposition to the Jedi Council's authority. They had not signed on for a replacement authority. They had signed on for something different. They sent a transmission to the lead ship requesting a formal council session. The request used the same term the Jedi High Council used for its sessions. That was either accidental or extremely deliberate, and the chronicler's note on the subject suggested she believed it was the latter. Ajunta Pal did not call a council session. He requested that the representatives of the 14 come aboard the lead ship in person, which required shuttling across the transit gap between vessels. A minor inconvenience that was also a small demonstration of where the center of the fleet's gravity was. They came, 7 of them. They sat in the main gathering area of the lead ship and stated their position clearly and without hostility. They wanted a vote on governance structure before any final destination was chosen. Ajunta Pal listened to the full presentation. Then he did something that nobody in the room had anticipated. He reached into the Force, not aggressively, not toward anyone present. He reached into the space of the room itself, the air, the metal of the floor and walls, the subtle energetic field that ran through the ship systems. And he did something to all of it simultaneously that took approximately 4 seconds and left every person in the room with the clear, wordless understanding that what they had just witnessed was not a demonstration of threat, but of scale, of what one person who had spent 31 years studying the Force could do when the gap between intention and action was narrow, and the current was close. The room was quiet for a long time afterward. The 7 representatives returned to their ships. No formal vote on governance structure was called. The fracture closed. The chronicler, who had been present in the corner of the room and had not been acknowledged by anyone, wrote for a long time that evening. She wrote, "He did not hurt anyone. He did not threaten. He simply allowed them to understand the size of the gap between what they knew and what he knew. And they decided that the gap was large enough to constitute authority. I do not know if that is leadership or something else. I do not know if there is a difference. This is the question Zendor's paper never reached, because it was stopped too early. I think it is the question we are all going to spend the rest of our lives inside." By the 60th day, Karnas had moved to rodents. The ships carried small, warm-blooded creatures in the agricultural section as part of the protein cycle. Nothing unusual, a standard long voyage provision. He requested access through the ship's resource coordinator, gave a general explanation about nutritional research, and received a batch of 6. He housed them in his berth in a container fashioned from cargo material and began working. The insects had taught him patience. More specifically, they had taught him that patience was not the same as slowness. You could move quickly if you understood exactly what you were reaching toward. The insect nervous system was simple, a handful of pathways, limited range, responses that were more reflex than choice. The rodent nervous system was different in kind, not just degree. There were layers. There were what seemed to be preference structures. The creatures had things they moved toward and things they moved away from. And those preferences were distributed across the system rather than concentrated in a single pathway. He had to map it before he could touch it. That took 9 days. On the 10th, he restructured a single pathway in the first rodent's sensory processing system, not the movement pathways, which was what he had worked with in the insects, but the layer beneath them, the layer that received information and determined what the information meant. The rodent heard a sound. Its processing system, restructured, interpreted that sound as a force-generated signal rather than ambient noise. It turned. It moved toward the source of the signal. It sat there and waited until Moore stopped generating the signal, at which point it moved back to its original position and resumed its earlier activity as if nothing unusual had occurred. He ran the same sequence 6 times before he trusted the result. On the 11th day, he brought a full report to Ajunta Pal, not just results, method, sequence, every adjustment he had made and its effect. He laid the pages out on the table in the older man's quarters and stood back and waited. Ajunta Pal read every page. He asked 4 questions. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. And when he looked down again, there was something in his expression that Karnas had not seen there before. "This is the beginning of something significant," Ajunta Pal said. Karnas nodded. He had known that. He wanted to hear what came next. "Ask me something," Ajunta Pal said. It was an odd instruction. Karnas turned it over for a moment and then decided the most honest question was also the most direct one. "Is what we are doing right?" Ajunta Pal did not answer immediately. He looked at the pages on the table. He looked at the corridor through the open doorway, where 2 other exiles were walking past without paying attention to what was happening inside the room. "Define right," he said finally, "in a space where the code does not reach." Karnas opened his mouth. He did not have an answer. He had not expected the question to be returned to him in that form. They sat in silence for a while. Neither of them reached a conclusion. They did not continue the conversation that evening. They both returned to their work separately, and the unfinished exchange sat between them like a door left open onto an empty corridor. Present, neither shut nor walked through. In her berth 3 decks below, the chronicler wrote it down exactly as it had happened. She recorded the question and the counter-question and the silence that followed, and the fact that the silence was never broken. Then she added, "This conversation will not end here. It cannot. Every argument we carry forward from this fleet, every choice made on whatever world we eventually reach, will be one more attempt to answer what they did not finish saying tonight. I will keep recording. I do not think I will live to see the answer." She was right about both things. On the 67th day, the fleet crossed beyond the boundary of any charted star system. Republic space ended not with a line or a marker, but with a simple absence. The point past which no navigation record existed. No beacon signal reached. No communication array could relay a message back to any inhabited world. They were, in every practical sense, gone. The Republic did not know where they were. The Jedi Order did not know where they were. No one was coming after them. No one was looking. Ajunta Pal stood at the viewport of the lead ship's forward observation deck and watched the unfamiliar starfield for a long time. At his back, the corridor was quiet. The ship hummed around him with the low, steady sound of functional machinery, the only constant that had remained unchanged since Coruscant. He thought about the vote, the 8 masters in their circle. The Targrutan woman's voice saying the hearing had concluded. The stone plates 2 floors below with 32 fresh absences where names had been ground away. He thought about the rodent in Karnas Muir's container, turning toward a signal it had not been born knowing how to hear, waiting patiently at the source until it was released, then returning to its ordinary life, as if the 2 things could coexist without contradiction. He put his hand flat against the viewport glass. The surface was cold. Somewhere far behind him, past distances that had no practical meaning now, Coruscant glowed in the dark like a found object. He left it there. He turned around. He walked back down the corridor toward the maintenance room, where his own work waited. What had been practiced on a small, warm-blooded creature in a cargo container was not an endpoint. It was a proof. The method worked. Organic tissue responded to force restructuring the same way inorganic material did. Not identically, not simply, but responsively. Predictably, given enough care and enough sequence. On Korriban, 30 years from this moment, something older and more resistant than a rodent would be waiting. He did not know the planet's name yet. He did not know what lived there. He knew only that the current of the Force was close, and the space ahead was uncharted, and the question left open in his quarters 3 decks back was not finished. Neither was he. The planet appeared on the forward senses before anyone saw it with their eyes. A technician on the lead ship's navigation deck called out the reading in a flat, professional voice. Mass, gravity, atmospheric composition, distance. The numbers were ordinary. What was not ordinary was the color. The sensors described the surface as predominantly ferrous oxide, a geological condition that existed on dozens of worlds across the galaxy. But when the fleet dropped out of hyperspace, and the viewport filled with what those numbers actually looked like, several people in the forward observation area stopped what they were doing and simply stared. The planet was red. Not the red of a sunset or a warning light or any of the familiar reddish tones that showed up in urban environments. This was older than any of those things. A deep, settled red that looked less like a color and more like a decision, as if the world had chosen, at some point in its long history, to stop being anything other than what it was, and had held to that ever since. Ajunta Pal stood at the viewport for 4 minutes. He did not speak. Then he turned to the navigation coordinator and said they would establish a holding orbit and send serve drones to the surface before any landing approach. The survey took 2 days. What the drones returned showed a world with a breathable atmosphere, a network of deep river-carved valleys in the northern hemisphere, and a concentration of structures in the largest valley basin, buildings, or rather the outer edges of a city, visible from high altitude as a geometric pattern pressed into the red landscape. Something lived here, something that built. He had not expected that. None of them had. The unknown regions were unknown, in part because exploration was difficult, and in part because the Republic had never devoted serious resources to finding out what was there. The assumption, unstated but present in every conversation about destination that had happened aboard the fleet during the crossing, was that they were heading toward empty space, habitable but unoccupied, a blank surface to write on. The Valley City was not blank. He called a full council of senior members that evening and laid out the survey data without editorializing. The city existed. Its inhabitants were not yet fully characterized. The drones had captured images of figures moving through the streets below, but not at sufficient resolution for detailed analysis. What was clear was that this was a functioning civilization, not a scattered population. The buildings had order. The streets had pattern. Whatever lived down there had been organizing itself for a long time. The council's response divided along a line that Ajunta Pal had expected. Some members argued for finding a different world, an uninhabited one, which had always been the implicit plan. Others argued that an inhabited world with an existing power structure offered resources and knowledge that an empty planet could not. The argument on both sides was practical. Nobody framed it as a moral question. The chronicler, present as always in the corner of the room, wrote that evening, "The possibility of harm to whatever species lives below was raised exactly once, by a woman whose name I will record here as Devis. It was not answered. The conversation moved on. I note this not as condemnation. I note it because I think it will matter later." Ajunta Pal made his decision the following morning. They would land. The beings who came out of the Valley City to meet the descending ships were tall, averaging nearly 2 meters, red-skinned, with bone spurs that curved back from their cheekbones and foreheads in formations that varied from individual to individual. Their eyes were a deep amber gold, and they moved with a quality that was hard to categorize at first. Not aggression, not fear. Something older than either. A kind of formal intentionality, as if every movement they made had been considered before it was performed. They numbered in the hundreds. They arranged themselves in a wide formation at the edge of the landing area without being directed to do so. At the front of the formation, elevated slightly on a natural rock shelf that gave him a clear sightline to the descending ramps, stood a single figure in robes of a dark material that caught the light differently from the surrounding garments. This was the high priest. He had held his position for 22 years, which was slightly longer than Ajunta Pal had served the Jedi Order. His people called him by a title rather than a name in formal contexts. The name he had been given at birth was used only in private, among family, in the way that many cultures reserve personal names for intimacy rather than function. The title translated approximately as the voice between powers, the one who stood in the gap between the divine forces his people believed governed existence and the mortal population those forces had created. He had been told by the oral traditions passed through every generation of his order that this day would come, beings of great power arriving from beyond the sky to complete what the first gods had left unfinished. The traditions were specific about the arrival. They were less specific about what came after. He watched the ramps descend from the nearest ship. He watched the first figures emerge. They looked like nothing the traditions had described. The traditions spoke of light and height and voices that carried across distances without mechanical assistance. What emerged from the ship ramps were 40-odd beings of various species, some human, some not, dressed in the practical clothing of people who had been traveling for a long time. Several of them were visibly tired. One was adjusting something mechanical on the cuff of her sleeve, with the distracted focus of a person solving a minor problem. The high priest watched all of this. He did not change his expression. He had spent 22 years learning to keep his thoughts off his face in situations where showing them would be a disadvantage. Then the last figure emerged from the lead ship. Ajunta Pal descended the ramp slowly, not because he was hesitant, because he was reading the formation below him, the way he had spent decades learning to read a room, the hundreds of assembled figures, their arrangement, the elevated position of the robed one at the front, the quality of attention that the whole group directed toward him. Not hostile, not afraid, expectant. They were waiting for something specific. He needed to understand what before he reached the ground. He understood it by the time he was halfway down. They believed he was supposed to be here. He reached the bottom of the ramp and stood on Korriban's surface for the first time. The ground was warm through the soles of his boots in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. The force here was not close the way it had been in deep space. It was layered, dense, as if the planet itself had been accumulating it for longer than anyone had been counting. The high priest descended from his rock shelf and walked forward. He stopped at a distance of approximately 3 meters and performed a gesture, both hands open, held at chest height, palms facing upward. That the translation records later confirmed was the gesture his people made when acknowledging the presence of something that surpassed their framework for understanding. Ajunta Pal looked at the open hands. He looked at the assembled formation behind the priest. He looked at the valley city rising in carved stone behind all of them, older than anything the Republic had built on Coruscant in living memory. He did not correct what the gesture meant. He accepted it. His response was deliberate. He looked directly at the high priest, held the man's amber gaze for a long moment, and then stepped past him. Not aggressively, not dismissively, but with the ease of someone moving through a space that already belongs to them. He walked toward the valley city. He did not look back. After a pause of perhaps 3 seconds, the high priest turned and followed. The chronicler wrote that evening, he did not sit in the throne they showed him. He stood beside it. The priest's people interpreted this as meaning the throne was beneath him, that he required no seat because his authority needed no symbol. I watched Ajunta Pal's face while this interpretation spread through the assembled crowd. He was listening to it. He was measuring how far it carried. He did not correct it. I think he understood in that moment that the interpretation was more useful than any claim he could have made directly. The high priest spent the first season doing two things simultaneously. The first was his formal function, introducing the arriving fleet to the structures of his people's civilization, managing the logistics of housing several hundred new inhabitants in a city built for thousands, translating between the two groups through a combination of hand gesture, drawn diagram, and the particular attentiveness that develops between beings who need to understand each other and have no shared language to begin with. The second was private. He was building a record of what he observed in a notation system his order used for internal documents that were not meant for general circulation. He wrote at night, after his official duties ended, in the same manner the chronicler wrote aboard the ships, by low light, in careful detail, without visible judgment. What he recorded in those first weeks was the gap between what his traditions had told him to expect and what had actually arrived. The traditions described divine completion. What arrived was a coalition of exiles from a distant government who had strong abilities and sophisticated knowledge, and a serious disagreement with the institution that had trained them. They were not gods. They were very capable people who had been told to leave and had decided to make something out of the leaving. He wrote, "They carry power the way a river carries force, not because they chose to, but because it moves through them. Whether that is the same as divinity depends on what divinity is supposed to mean. I have spent 22 years in the position that is supposed to know the answer to that question. I find that I am less certain than I was." He did not share this record with anyone. He did not resist the new arrivals. He did not flee. He remained precisely where he was, in the position he had always occupied, doing the work his people needed him to do. And he watched. This was the decision that would shape everything that came after. Not the decision of the man who arrived with power, but the decision of the man who stayed and observed. The scholars who came later, in the quiet generation that grew up inside the Sith civilization, learned the practice of careful witnessing from the archives the high priest left behind. They did not know his name. He had erased it himself before the first season ended, for reasons he did not record. What remained was the method. Stay present. Record accurately. Do not mistake observation for approval. The warrior's name was Teth. He had served in the high priest's household guard for 6 years, a position that carried status among his people because proximity to the voice between powers was understood as proximity to the forces the priest represented. He was 31 years old, experienced in the combat forms his people had developed over generations, and genuinely curious about the alchemical work he had watched Ajunta Pal's people conducting in the outer buildings of the city since their arrival. He volunteered. This distinction matters. Nobody compelled him. Nobody promised him something false. Ajunta Pal, through the translation system that had been established over 3 months of patient communication, explained what the process involved, not in full technical detail, because the terminology had no equivalent in Teth's language, but in general terms. His nervous system would be adjusted. His capacity to receive and respond to force-generated signals would be extended beyond what he could currently do naturally. The process carried risk. He might experience discomfort during and after. There was no guarantee that every aspect of the result would be predictable. Teth said yes. He said it clearly, without the performance of bravery that his guard training had given him access to. He said yes, the way someone says yes to a journey they have been thinking about for long enough that the decision feels finished before it is spoken. The work took 3 days. Karnas Moore conducted it, with Ajunta Pal present and observing throughout. The method they used was a significant expansion of what had been developed on the rodents during the crossing. More precise, more layered, operating across multiple systems simultaneously rather than targeting a single pathway. Teth was conscious for most of it, at his own insistence, seated in a chair at the center of a room cleared of everything except the 2 practitioners and a recording apparatus the chronicler had set up at the doorway. On the first day, nothing appeared to happen from the outside. Teth sat still. Moore worked. Ajunta Pal watched. At intervals, Moore asked Teth a question. What do you feel? Describe what has changed. Is this different from a moment ago? And Teth answered in his own language, which the translator carried into notes that the chronicler transcribed afterward. On the second day, the room's ambient temperature dropped 3 degrees without any mechanical cause and then returned to normal over approximately 2 hours. Teth described a sensation of expansion, not physical, not painful, that he compared to the feeling of standing at the edge of a high place and looking at a horizon much wider than expected. On the third day, he stood up from the chair and held out his hand, and something in the corner of the room moved toward him without being touched. Not a large object. A cup, left on a surface near the wall by someone who had not cleared the room as thoroughly as instructed. It slid approximately half a meter before stopping. Teth looked at it. He looked at his own hand. He looked at Ajunta Pal. Ajunta Pal said in the translated approximation of Teth's language. Again, Teth extended his focus. The cup moved another half meter. The session ended. The chronicler wrote. The warrior smiled. Not the smile of someone who has won something. The smile of someone who has been given a gift so large they cannot yet see its edges. Ajunta Pal watched the smile. He did not return it. He asked Moore a technical question about the stability of the pathway modification, and they discussed the answer in detail while the warrior stood in the center of the room holding his own hand and examining it. Teth served in Ajunta Pal's household for 63 years. His abilities grew over that time, not dramatically, not at the pace of someone born to a deep connection with the Force, but steadily, reliably, in the way that careful cultivation produces results that raw gift sometimes does not. He became skilled. He became trusted. He trained others in the extended techniques his own restructured system made possible, and those students trained students of their own, and the method spread through the Sith population in ways that were not always traceable back to the 3 days in that cleared room. He died in his 93rd year, which was old even by the standards of his people. His death was peaceful. He was attended by members of the household he had served, and by 2 of his students, who were by that point themselves considerably skilled. He never found a word for what the process had cost him. He knew something had been exchanged, not lost. Exactly. Nothing had been taken without his agreement, but modified. The way a river is modified by the construction of a channel that directs it. The water still flows, but it flows differently than it would have, and the direction it has been given serves purposes beyond its own. He had agreed to the channel. He had agreed with full knowledge that a channel was what he was agreeing to. And he had spent 63 years being exactly as useful as the channel made him, without ever finding the language for what it felt like to be a thing that had been reshaped by something that understood its structure better than it understood itself. The high priest recorded his death in the private archive. He wrote, "Teth is gone. He was the first. He was not the last. I have watched many follow the same path since that third day, and none of them have found the word either. I am beginning to think the word does not exist in any language that is used on this planet. Perhaps it exists somewhere else. Perhaps it is the kind of word that only gets invented after the thing it describes has already happened to enough people for the absence of language to become unbearable. That day may come. I will keep writing until it does or until I cannot." He kept his position. He kept his archive. He stayed exactly where he was, in the gap between powers, watching and recording, and not mistaking either activity for the other. That archive outlasted him. The scholars who found it 3 generations later would spend years arguing about what it meant. They would reach no consensus. The question it asked, whether a gift given in exchange for something unnamed was still a gift, was the kind of question that produced debate rather than answers. It was, in that way, a fitting inheritance from someone who had stood for 22 years in the space between certainty and understanding, and had never once pretended the gap was smaller than it was. The child's fever broke on the 4th night. Her mother had carried her into Zozan's treatment hall at sunset, the way parents in the Valley City had begun doing over the past decade when the usual remedies failed. When the herbal preparations the Sith healers had used for generations ran out of answers and something older and less nameable was needed. The child was 7 years old. Her temperature had been climbing for 3 days. The local physicians had done everything their training offered and had then sent for the woman in the stone building at the eastern edge of the residential quarter. The one who was not from this world and who worked with her hands in a way that left no mark on the surface of the skin. Zozan had been awake for most of those 3 days herself. She worked on the child for approximately 6 hours, seated beside the low sleeping platform in the inner room of the hall, both hands resting near but not on the child's torso. She did not speak during this. She rarely did during treatment. What she was doing required a quality of attention that conversation interrupted, and she had learned early in her Jedi training that the body under her focus was itself a kind of language, one that answered questions more precisely than any verbal exchange could. At the end of the 6th hour, the fever dropped, not gradually. It dropped the way a held object drops when the hand opens, completely and all at once. The child slept. The mother, who had been sitting against the far wall with her hands clasped in her lap for the entire 6 hours, made a sound that had no precise equivalent in any language the chronicler had yet documented. The chronicler, who had been present in the corner of the room at Zozan's standing invitation, she had told the chronicler once that historical accuracy required a witness, and she preferred witnesses who understood what they were seeing. Wrote in her record that the sound was the closest thing to pure relief she had encountered in 11 years of keeping notes. Zozan stood, stretched her back, and asked the kitchen section of the hall to prepare something for the mother to eat. By 6960 BBY, the Valley City held approximately 4,000 permanent residents. The original Sith species population, supplemented by the exile community, now numbering several hundred after attrition from the crossing years and the early period of adaptation to Korriban's climate and biology. The two populations had not merged in any simple sense. They remained distinct in language, in cultural practice, in the particular social textures that develop between groups with different histories. But they had built something functional in the space between those distinctions. Markets where both groups traded. Medical halls like Zosan's, where knowledge from two separate traditions had been combined into something neither tradition could have produced alone. Agricultural terraces on the valley slopes, where the soil modification techniques developed from Carnus Moore's early experiments now supported crops that the planet's native growing conditions should not have been able to sustain. The terraces were Sek's favorite place on Korriban. He went there most mornings before his lessons began, while the light was still coming in at a low angle over the valley rim, and the red dust that coated everything had not yet been stirred up by foot traffic. He was 23 years old, the son of a Sith species family from the residential quarter, and had been studying with Zozan for 4 years. His name, Sech, the one who learns without sleeping, had been given to him at birth by a grandmother who apparently recognized something in the way he tracked. Movement with his eyes in the first days of his life. It had proven accurate. He slept as little as his body required, and spent the remainder of his time either studying or thinking about studying. He stood on the terrace each morning and looked at what was growing there and felt something that he had tried several times to describe to Zosan and had never quite gotten right. It was not pride exactly. It was closer to evidence. The terraces existed because two groups of people with two separate bodies of knowledge had combined those bodies into something larger than either. And the ground that should have been too dry and too iron-saturated to support root systems was now producing food that kept 4,000 people healthy. You could walk between the rows and touch the leaves of plants that had no business being alive on this soil and understand, in a concrete and undeniable way, that the combination had produced something real. He brought this observation to Zosan one morning, standing in the doorway of her treatment hall before the day's first patients arrived. She listened to him describe it. Then she said, "What you are describing is the result of power applied in service of need, not power restrained by fear of what it might do if applied fully. Power used." He turned this over. The Jedi would say that power used without restraint becomes something dangerous. The Jedi would say many things, Zosan said. What they built was an institution that taught its members to be afraid of their own capacity. The terraces are not afraid of what they are. They simply grow. She paused. Compassion is not diminished by coming from a position of strength. It is made more effective. A healer who holds back because she fears her own knowledge helps fewer people than one who uses everything available to her. This is what I was not permitted to understand inside the Order. This is what we are permitted to understand here. Sech thought about this for a long time afterward. He was still thinking about it when he went to bed that evening. He was still thinking about it in a way that had slowly become part of the architecture of how he understood everything else. Years after the conversation had ended, Zosan had not invented this argument. It was older than her tenure on Korriban, older, in fact, than the exile itself. The man who had stood in the center of the council's circle in 7003 BBY had made a version of the same case, in different terms, to 8 masters who declined to hear it. The argument had not changed. The context had. On Coruscant, it had been a philosophical claim with no material evidence. On Korriban, it grew food in dry soil and broke fevers in 7-year-old children. The script does not point this out. It does not need to. Zosan taught 43 students across her decades on Korriban. She kept records of all of them. Not academic records in the temple sense, but observation notes. What each student was drawn to, what each resisted, what each understood quickly, and what required a different approach before it landed. She treated teaching the same way she treated healing, as a diagnostic practice. You paid attention to what the person in front of you actually was, not to what the framework said they should be. Sech was, by her private assessment, the most genuinely curious student she had ever worked with. Not the most gifted in terms of raw force sensitivity. Several others surpassed him in that, but the most interested in understanding why things worked the way they did rather than simply learning that they did. He asked questions that came from 2 directions at once. What is this? And what does this mean that it exists? The combination made him slow in some areas and exceptionally thorough in others. She noted in his record, in the 31st year of Korriban's Sith civilization, Sek will outlast most of what is being built here. Not because he is stronger than the others, but because he is paying attention to the right things. He is watching the structure, not the surface. When the surface changes, and it will change, surfaces always do, he will still have the structure to orient by. She did not tell him she had written this. She rarely shared her assessment notes with their subjects. What she did tell him, in a session that took place in the terrace that year, was that the work they were doing together had reached a point where the students' knowledge was beginning to approach the teachers in certain specific areas, and that this was not a problem. It was the intended outcome. She said that the measure of a teacher was not how much the student needed them at the end, but how capable the student had become of continuing without them. Sech asked if she was preparing him for something. She said that everything prepares everyone for something. The question is whether you are paying attention when it arrives. Karnas Moore was paying attention to something else entirely. He had been on Korriban for 23 years by the time the prohibition came down, and in those years he had moved from the modest berth on the mid-deck of a crossing ship to a compound on the northern edge of the valley city with 3 dedicated workrooms and a staff of 8. 4 Sith species assistants he had trained himself, and 4 former members of the exile community, whose particular skills made them useful for extended projects. The compound sat slightly apart from the main residential area, which was partly a practical choice. Some of his work produced sounds and atmospheric effects that his neighbors had occasionally found alarming, and partly a reflection of how Moore had always operated. Not at the center of the community's social life, but adjacent to it, present enough to be considered part of the coalition, separate enough to work without interruption. He was 51 years old. The restlessness that had driven him as a young knight in the temple had not diminished with age. It had organized itself. He still moved fast, still found institutional structures confining, still felt the gap between what he understood to be possible and what the people around him were willing to attempt. What had changed was his capacity to sustain a single line of inquiry across years rather than months. The project Ajunta Pal had prohibited was not new. The seed of it had been planted during the crossing, in the birth with the insects, when Moore had first worked on redirecting a nervous system, rather than simply observing one. The question he had been following ever since was logical and, he believed, inevitable. If a living nervous system could be restructured to receive external force signals, could a construct be built, not a natural creature, but a manufactured one that operated entirely on those signals? No baseline biology, no competing instincts, no organic drive system running underneath the directed behavior and occasionally producing results that were difficult to predict. A fully obedient instrument. The prohibition had been delivered without drama. Ajunta Pal had called him into a private meeting approximately 8 months after Moore began the formal research phase, indicated that he was aware of the project, and stated that it was to be discontinued. He gave one reason: the constructs would work. Moore had pressed for elaboration. Ajunta Pal had offered none. The meeting had lasted 11 minutes. Moore had discontinued the formal research phase. He had not discontinued thinking. The distinction, in practice, meant that the written records of the project no longer existed in any form that a search of his compound would have uncovered. The knowledge those records had contained was stored somewhere searches could not reach. He spent the following years building on it in ways that did not look like building: subsidiary techniques, adjacent methods, the slow accumulation of practical understanding that would, when the time came, allow him to move quickly from concept to execution. He was not impatient in the way he had been at 26. He had learned that sequence mattered. Ajunta Pal had told him that. Years ago on the crossing ship, watching a rodent turn toward a signal with its restructured nervous system. He had agreed then, and still agreed. Sequence mattered. The sequence he was following had its own logic, its own destination. What Ajunta Pal understood, the reason behind the prohibition that he had not shared in that 11-minute meeting, was that a fully autonomous, alchemical construct was not a tool. It was a precedent. Once the principle existed, once it had been demonstrated as achievable, every subsequent argument about the limits of what the Sith arts should be used to create became harder to make. You could not prohibit a direction of inquiry by pointing to a boundary that nobody had yet crossed. You could only prohibit it before the crossing. After the first successful construct existed, the boundary was already behind you. Moore knew this too. He simply reached a different conclusion about it. The constructs would be ready when they were needed. He did not rush. He did not announce. He continued his other work. Legitimate, recognized, genuinely valuable work in the expansion of the alchemical arts that had earned him considerable standing in the community, and he let the years accumulate. And he kept the knowledge in the one place nobody had authority to search: in his own mind, behind his own eyes. Patient as the valley city, settled as the red ground, he would wait. He was good at waiting now. He had learned it from the same place he had learned everything else that mattered. From the long dark between the stars, where there was nothing to do but think, and thinking had nowhere to go except deeper. The demonstration happened in the open courtyard at the center of the valley city, which meant everyone saw it. Carnus Moore had chosen the location deliberately. He could have conducted the demonstration in his compound, in controlled conditions, before a selected audience. He chose the courtyard because selected audiences produced selected conclusions, and he was not interested in a conclusion that could be disputed on the grounds of who had been allowed to witness it. He wanted the thing seen. He wanted its existence to become a fact that the community held collectively, The way a shared meal becomes part of a group's history, present in everyone's account, impossible to locate only in one person's telling. He released them at midday, when the light was high and the shadows were short, and there was no atmospheric condition that could be blamed for what people observed. There were 6 of them. They had no name yet. Naming would come later, when others tried to describe what they'd seen and found that description required a category, and categories require names. At that moment, they were simply present. 6 constructs, each roughly the size of a large domesticated animal, moving through the courtyard in a formation that had not been programmed through any mechanical means. No remote device, no vocal command. They responded to force-generated signals alone, the way Teth had responded to signals in that cleared room decades earlier, but with a precision and an immediacy that no organic nervous system, however carefully restructured, could quite match. They were not alive. That was the part that settled into the watching crowd with the particular weight of something that changes the air of a place permanently. They were not alive, and they moved with a purpose that living things usually required consciousness to produce. And the combination of those 2 facts occupied a category that nobody present had words for. Ajuntapal stood at the far edge of the courtyard. He had known the demonstration was coming. Word had reached him the previous evening, and he had made the calculation that preventing it by force would be a worse outcome than allowing it to proceed. He watched the 6 constructs move through their patterns. He watched the faces of the people around him watching them. He had been right about what they would do. He had prohibited the project because he knew it would work. It had worked. The debate that followed lasted 3 weeks. It was conducted in the large gathering hall, in sessions that were open to any member of the community who wished to attend, which was itself a departure from the way decisions had been made under Ajuntapal's leadership. He had not ruled through formal consensus. He had led through demonstrated authority, through being the person in the room whose understanding of the Force was deepest and whose judgment had the longest track record. The gathering hall sessions were Moore's format, not his. By agreeing to participate in them, Ajuntapal had already conceded something he did not fully acknowledge conceding. Moore's argument was structured in 3 parts, delivered across the first week of sessions in a manner that suggested careful preparation over a long period. The first part was historical. He argued that Ajuntapal's leadership style had carried the habits of the Jedi Order into the exile without examining them. The Order had governed through hierarchy and the suppression of divergent practice. What had developed on Korriban over 30 years was a hierarchy with Ajuntapal at its center and a set of informal prohibitions, like the one on autonomous constructs, that functioned the same way the Code's restrictions had functioned in the temple. Not through enforcement, but through the social pressure of a community that had learned what its leader considered acceptable. The second part was practical. The constructs existed. Their capabilities were observable. Any civilization that chose not to develop them would eventually face one that had. This was not an argument for recklessness. It was an argument for honesty about the direction the alchemical arts were already moving, and the cost of refusing to follow them. The third part was the one that shifted the room. Muir stood in the gathering hall on the 8th day and said, "Ajuntapal told me, on the crossing ship, that sequence mattered. He was right. I followed the sequence. I understood what he meant before he understood what I would do with it. He taught me that lesson. I am now the lesson. Several members of the older exile community, who had supported Ajunta Paul's position through the first week of sessions, were observed, in the chronicler's account, to exchange glances at this point. The chronicler wrote, "It was not the argument that moved them. Arguments had been made for a week, and the positions had held. It was the demonstration that they had been led by someone who could produce a student capable of surpassing the prohibition. They were calculating what that meant about the future." Ajunta Pal responded to the three-part argument across the following week. He was 73 years old. His physical presence had diminished from what it had been in the Coruscant Council chamber. But his clarity had not. He sat rather than stood, a concession to age that he did not attempt to disguise, and he spoke in the measured cadence that had characterized his address style for 5 decades. He said that the constructs were not the question. The question was what the community was for. If the answer was the expansion of the alchemical arts without limit, then Moore's position was consistent with the answer. If the answer was the building of something that could sustain itself across generations, something that had a shape, a direction, a reason for existing beyond the capabilities of its current practitioners, then limits were not restrictions. They were structure. A building without load-bearing walls was not a building. It was a pile of material that happened to be standing. Moore said that the pile was already standing. Ajunta Pal's structure had not prevented it. The vote, when it came, was close. Not as close as the vote in the Jedi Council chamber had been. That one had been unanimous against the losing side, which was its own kind of statement. This one split the community nearly down the center, with Ajunta Pal's position holding a narrow majority among the exile community, and Moore's position carrying significantly more support among Sith species members who had come into the alchemical arts through the past 2 decades of teaching. The narrow majority was enough. Formal authority remained where it had been. What formal authority could not accomplish was making Moore stop. Veth had been 14 years old when Teth, the first volunteer, the one who had served for decades and died without finding the word for what he had given up, had brought him into the compound for preliminary assessment. Teth had identified something in the boy's force sensitivity that warranted attention, and the assessment had confirmed it. He had been placed in training shortly after, split between 2 instructors whose approaches were different enough that the split itself became part of his education. From Ajunta Pal's faction, he learned precision and patience, the careful mapping of a system before touching it, the understanding that power applied without full knowledge of what it was being applied to produced results that could not be recalled. From Moore's network, informal, never officially acknowledged, but present throughout the compound culture of the Northern Edge, he learned speed and improvisation. The understanding that waiting for full knowledge was itself a choice with consequences, that the moment of action was always preceded by incomplete information, and that accepting this was not recklessness but realism. He was 31 when the formal conflict began. He had spent 17 years learning from both directions simultaneously, which meant that by the time the community split, he understood each side's position more thoroughly than most of its own adherents did. This was not a comfortable position to occupy. The fighting started in the 4th month after the vote, not between the community's senior members. The debate had been civil, and the loss of the vote had not immediately transformed Moore's supporters into a military faction. What began it was smaller and more human than a political rupture. A construct, operating near the residential quarter on a task its signals had not fully specified, damaged a building and injured two Sith species residents. Muir's people said the construct had been interfered with by someone opposing the project. Ajunta Pal's people said the construct's design was inherently unstable in proximity to inhabited areas. The argument produced 3 days of rising tension, and then a fight in the market quarter between individuals on both sides. And after that, it was no longer a debate. Veth did not fight in that market. He had been at the terrace. Zosan's former student Sech had a practice of visiting the agricultural sections in the mornings, and Veth had fallen into the habit of meeting him there. When the sounds from the market reached them, both men stood on the terrace for a moment listening, and then Sek said he needed to find Zozan, and Veth said nothing, and they went in opposite directions. The war lasted 6 years, short by the measure of most conflicts, long by the measure of what it did to the valley city and the surrounding terrain. The alchemical weapons deployed by both sides, constructs on one, restructured environmental systems on the other, produced damage to Korriban's geology that took centuries to repair. Sections of the valley wall were destabilized. 2 of the agricultural terraces were destroyed. The market quarter was rebuilt twice. Veth moved through those 6 years in a way that the chronicler found difficult to categorize. He was present. He treated wounded on both sides, using the healing techniques he had learned from Zosan's tradition. He relayed information between factions when breakdown of communication threatened to produce worse violence than continuation of engagement. He did not fight for either side. He did not publicly declare a position. In the 4th year, someone on Muir's side accused him of being a spy for Ajunta Pal. In the 5th year, someone on Ajunta Pal's side accused him of feeding information to Muir. Both accusations were made without evidence and did not result in formal proceedings, but they produced a change in how people treated him, a slight but unmistakable withdrawal, the social temperature of a community deciding that a person who would not choose was choosing something it did not trust. He had understood something that neither side had. He had understood it in the gathering hall during the final week of debate, listening to both arguments laid out with full force by 2 people who were each correct about half of what they were saying and blind to the other half. Winning would not settle the question. The question was not about constructs. It was not about succession or structure, or the appropriate limits of the alchemical arts. The question was the same one that had been left unfinished in Ajunta Pal's quarters on the crossing ship, the one the chronicler had noted in her record decades ago. What does right mean in a space where the old rules no longer apply? Muir had answered, it means whatever the strongest practitioner can sustain. Ajunta Pal had answered, it means whatever the community can hold together. Both answers were incomplete. Both had produced the war currently taking place around him. He did not have a third answer. He had only the recognition that neither existing answer was sufficient, and the recognition that nobody in either faction wanted to hear that said aloud. The war ended when Muir's network was defeated in a coordinated action across the northern compounds. The defeat was not total. Several key members of Muir's faction escaped, and Muir himself was not captured. What ended was his presence on Korriban. He left the planet before the final action closed off the routes out of the valley, taking what he could carry and leaving the rest. His constructs, without the sustained force-generated signals that directed them, stopped moving within hours of his departure and remained where they stood until they were dismantled. Ajunta Pal had won. The community held. The vote's narrow majority had been enforced by 6 years of fighting, rather than by the persuasiveness of its arguments. He was 79 years old. He sat in the gathering hall after the final reports came in and held his hands on the table in front of him and looked at them for a long time. The chronicler wrote that he did not appear victorious. He appeared like someone who had arrived at a destination and found that the destination was not what the journey had implied it would be. Veth left the valley city on the morning of the last day of the 6th year. He did not announce it. He packed what he needed for an extended desert crossing: water, dried food, a bedroll, the 2 texts he found most worth rereading, and walked out of the residential quarter before the light was fully up. Nobody stopped him. The community was occupied with the aftermath of the final action, the logistics of dismantling the remaining constructs and assessing the damage to the northern compounds. He walked north, away from the valley, into the open terrain of Korriban's middle desert. The ground was the same deep red as the valley walls, broken by rock formations that cast long shadows in the early light. The air was dry and carried a faint mineral smell that he had lived with for most of his adult life and still found oddly settling. He did not leave a note. He left one recorded statement, spoken to the chronicler the evening before his departure, which she transcribed and preserved. It was not long, he said. Both sides exiled the one who asked the question they could not answer. The Jedi exiled Zendor. Ajunta Pal exiled Moore. I am not saying Moore was right. I am saying that the pattern of answering an argument by removing the person who made it tells you something about the argument. That it was not finished, that it is still being had, somewhere, by whoever is left to have it. I am not that person. I do not know who is. I am going to walk into the desert and find out what questions the desert asks. The chronicler wrote below his words. He left this morning. I watched him go from the east wall. He did not look back. I do not know if he is looking for an answer or for a place where the question does not follow. Perhaps those are the same direction. His last recorded words were copied into the early Sith archive by a scholar in the following generation who found the chronicler's transcript among the founding documents and understood, in a way that required no annotation, that the words mattered. The scholar's name was not recorded. They left only the copy, careful and exact, in the margin of which they added 3 words in their own hand. He was right. Reth had been keeping records since he was 19 years old. That was 47 years ago. He had begun because his teacher, a senior scholar in the High Priest's archive, long dead now, had told him that the most important quality a historian could develop was the habit of writing before he understood what he was writing about. Understanding came later, sometimes years later. What could not be recovered was the texture of the moment itself, the specific weight of an afternoon, the particular quality of attention in a room where something significant was being decided. That texture vanished if you waited until you understood it to put it down. You had to write it first and make sense of it afterward. Reth had followed this instruction faithfully for 47 years. He had written through the arrival of the exile fleet, through the early seasons of adaptation and construction, through the naming of Ajunta Pal as the first Dark Lord in a ceremony that his people had designed, and that the Dark Jedi had accepted without modification, because the ceremony was already close enough to what they wanted to say, that altering it would have cost more than it gained. Through the 6 years of the internal war, which he had spent in the archive building with the door barred, writing by lamplight, while the sounds of conflict moved through the valley outside. He was 66 years old now. His handwriting had not changed. Still the same compact, precise notation his teacher had drilled into him across 3 years of early training. His eyesight had, slightly. He kept a lens ground from Valley crystal on a cord around his neck and used it when the light was poor. He was using it on the morning that Sorza Sin came to the archive building for the first time. She was 42, which made her younger than Reth by nearly a quarter century. She had been born on the crossing ship, one of the handful of children delivered. During the transit, raised in the particular culture of people who had left one world and not yet reached another. She had no memory of Coruscant. She had no memory of the Jedi Order as a lived institution, only as a subject of description. Something the older exiles discussed the way people discuss a country they emigrated from, with a mixture of grievance and involuntary nostalgia that made the descriptions unreliable in specific ways. What she had instead of those memories was Korriban, the valley as it had looked when she was 4 years old, and the city was still being shaped, accommodate the arriving population. The particular red of the dust on everything, the smell of the agricultural terraces in the wet season. Zosan's treatment hall, where she had been brought twice as a child and once as a young adult after a training injury, and where she had observed, on each occasion, the specific quality of attention Zosan brought to healing. Total, organized, without visible effort. She had modeled her own working style on that quality of attention, applied it not to healing but to classification. She was, as a Junta Pal had assessed before assigning her the codification task, a systematizer. She looked at a body of accumulated knowledge and saw the structure underneath it, the load-bearing elements and the decorative ones, the principles that generated the specific practices, and the practices that had developed without clear principle and needed to be either grounded or discarded. She came to the archive building because the archive was where the accumulated knowledge lived. Not all of it. Much of what the exile community had developed lived in the heads of its practitioners rather than on any surface, but enough to serve as a foundation for the work she had been given. Reth watched her move through the archive's first room with the particular attention of someone who has spent a long time learning to observe without being noticed observing. She touched nothing. She read titles and notation marks on the outer edges of document containers without opening them. She was mapping the collection before engaging with it, the same way she had presumably mapped every other system she had ever approached. He introduced himself. She acknowledged the introduction with the brevity of someone whose attention was currently occupied by something more pressing, and who would give the social element its appropriate space once the pressing thing was handled. He decided he liked her. Efficiency of that quality was rarer than it looked. She worked in the archive building for 7 months before producing the first complete section of what became the foundational Sith text. The section covered the alchemical principles, not the specific techniques, which required separate volumes organized by application, but the underlying logic, why the methods worked, what they were reaching toward when they reached into organic tissue or mineral structure and altered the arrangement of what they found there, what the Force was doing during the process, and what the practitioner's role was in directing that doing. Reth read the completed section on the evening she finished it. She had left the pages on the reading table in the archive's main room without comment, which he had come to understand was her way of indicating that a thing was ready for external assessment. He read it twice. Then he sat for a while, with the lens cord in his hands, turning it over the way he did when he was thinking about something that required more than his first response. The section was accurate. He was not qualified to evaluate the technical content. That was the province of practitioners. But he could evaluate the structural logic, and the structural logic was sound, clear, organized in a way that made the material accessible to a careful reader who had not lived through the decades of experiment and failure that had produced it. That was the quality he sat with, the accessibility. What Sors's sin had produced was not a record of how the Sith arts had developed. It was a description of how they functioned, which was a different document entirely. A record of development included the failed attempts, the arguments about method, the decade-long detours that had produced nothing useful, and the moment someone had recognized why. It included Veth's question in the gathering hall and the fact that neither faction had answered it. It included the unfinished conversation in Ajunta Pal's quarters on the crossing ship. It included every place where the accumulated knowledge had been genuinely uncertain about itself. A description of function included none of those things. It included only what had been determined to work, organized into a system that a new practitioner could follow without needing to understand the history of the questions that had been set aside to reach it. He wrote in his private record that evening, "She has taken 40 years of argument and produced a manual. The manual is correct. It is also the end of the argument, because the argument required the uncertainty that the manual has resolved. I do not think she has done this intentionally. I think she looked at the accumulated knowledge and saw what was load-bearing and what was not, and removed the decorative elements. She did not recognize that some of what she classified as decorative was actually the architecture of doubt. Doubt was holding parts of this structure up. Now those parts are gone, and the structure is standing on something else. I am not certain yet what that something else is." He did not share this observation with Sors's sin. He did not share it with anyone. He added it to the private record that had been kept in the same coded notations since his teacher had first drilled it into him, and he filed it in the section of the archive that held materials not intended for circulation. The tombs had been Ajunta Pal's decision, made in the year following the internal war's end. He was 79 when he announced the project. The announcement was made in the same gathering hall where the debate had taken place, the same room where he had sat after the final reports came in and looked at his hands for a long time. The project was described as a record-keeping initiative. The valley's deepest section, currently unoccupied, would be given over to a series of permanent structures. Each structure would house the accumulated knowledge and personal effects of a significant figure in the community's history. The structures would be built to survive conditions that ordinary buildings could not. Sealed, reinforced, protected by methods that the alchemical arts made possible. He did not use the word tomb. He called them repositories. The architect assigned to the project was young, 28, trained in the engineering tradition that had developed on Korriban from a combination of Sith species, construction knowledge, and the technical education several of the exiles had brought from the Republic. His name is not recorded anywhere in the surviving archive. This is not an accident. He was skilled. He understood load distribution in carved stone in a way that most practitioners of his generation did not, because he had spent 3 years studying the oldest sections of the Valley City. Structures built before the exile fleet arrived, before any dark Jedi technique had been applied to Korriban's geology. and understanding how they had been made to last. The Valley City's oldest buildings had survived centuries of the temperature shifts, geological tremors, and dust storms that characterized the planet's cycles. He wanted to know why. He spent the 3 years finding out. The repository project gave him a context for that knowledge. He designed 8 structures in the first planning phase. Each was carved directly into the valley wall rather than built freestanding, a decision driven by structural reasoning, since the rock face provided stability that no constructed foundation could match. Each was sealed by methods that combined physical engineering with alchemical reinforcement of the stone itself, producing a closure that would hold against conditions beyond what any current threat on Korriban could produce. He understood, while designing the 8th structure, that the conditions he was engineering against were not limited to weather and geology. The reinforcement methods Sorza Sin's codification described, the ones that could be applied to stone, produced a level of protection that had no practical purpose in a stable civilization. They were designed for a civilization that expected to be attacked from outside by something with capabilities comparable to its own. He noted this in his working documents. He noted it once, in the margin of the structural specifications for the 8th repository, in a line that read, "These methods assume an adversary with equivalent force application capacity." Who is this adversary? He did not receive an answer. He completed the 8th structure. He built a 9th at Sorza Sin's request, deeper into the valley than the others, in a section of the rock face that his surveys had identified as geologically the most stable point in the entire formation, the most protected location, the place where something placed would be most likely to remain undisturbed regardless of what happened on the surface. Above, he completed the 9th structure in the spring of the following year. The door was a single piece of carved stone, fitted with the same alchemical reinforcement as the wall around it. The interior was dry, thermally stable, protected from electromagnetic interference by the depth of the rock above it. The inscription above the door was carved last. Sorza Sin provided the text. The word used was one that the Sith species language had developed over generations of philosophical scholarship, a term from the tradition the High Priest's Order had maintained, meaning the silence that remains when a question has been asked so many times that the asking itself has finally exhausted. The word that had no Republic equivalent. The word that meant, in the closest approximation any later translator could manage, the silence left behind when a question stops being asked. The architect carved it carefully. He had a good hand for inscription work. The precision that his structural training had developed transferred to smaller scales without difficulty. When the carving was finished, he ran his fingers along the cut edges to check depth and consistency. Then Sorza Sin told him to go inside. He understood the instruction. He had understood for some time that the question in the margin of his 8th structure specifications had been a question he should not have committed to writing. He had not destroyed the working documents because destroying documents felt to the kind of person who spent 3 years studying how old buildings were made to last, like a worse act than the alternative. He went inside. The door was sealed from the exterior. The stone above the entrance was warm for reasons that the valley's ambient temperature could not account for. It remained warm. Months later, when the Republic fleet arrived and moved through the valley sealing every repository it could locate, a Jedi Knight noted the warmth in her field report and moved on. Reth wrote in his private record on the evening of the sealing, The architect is inside the ninth repository. He built it better than any of the others. I have been told this by people whose assessment of structural quality I trust. He will be in there longer than any of the others, I think. The valley does not forget what it holds. It simply waits for someone to come looking who knows what they are looking for. Sorza's Sin has finished the first holocron. She presented it to Ajunta Pal this morning in a brief meeting I was not present for. I am told he held it for a long time without speaking. I do not know what he said when he finally did speak. I do not know if what he said was approval or grief or something that required a different word than either. I find that I am not surprised that I cannot determine which. The two have been difficult to separate on this planet for as long as I have been keeping records. Perhaps they were always the same response to the same situation, wearing different expressions depending on who was doing the feeling. I am 67 years old. I have written in this record for 48 years. I do not know how many more years I have. I know that whatever is coming, and something is coming, I feel this the way the valley walls feel a tremor before anyone on the surface registers it. I will write about it until I cannot hold the stylus. The tombs are finished. The doctrine is written. The question that Veth took into the desert has no home here anymore. I hope he found somewhere for it. I hope the desert was large enough. The Sith had a name for it before it arrived, the long approach. Spoken in the particular tone that languages develop for things that have been expected so long. They have become part of the culture's internal weather, not feared exactly, not welcomed, but held in a specific mental space reserved for the inevitable. Children born on Korriban in the generation after the internal war grew up hearing the term the way children in other places grow up hearing about seasons. It was coming. It had always been coming. The only question that anyone debated was the form it would take when it finally did. Sorza's Sin had been the most specific about that form. She had written, in a document distributed to the senior leadership 12 years before the fleet appeared on the censors, that the Republic would not send diplomats. Diplomats were appropriate for situations in which the sending party believed the receiving party had something to offer. The Sith had made themselves over a century into something the Republic did not want to negotiate with. They had done this deliberately. The consequence of deliberate choices was that the party affected by those choices eventually responded to them. The response would be military. It would be substantial. It would arrive without warning in the sense that no formal declaration would precede it, though anyone paying attention had decades of warning in every other sense. She had recommended a set of preparations. Most of them had been implemented. The alchemical constructs, rebuilt after the internal war's dismantling, refined across the following decade, now numbering in the hundreds rather than Moore's original 6, were distributed across the fleet and the valley city's outer perimeter. The hull modifications applied to every ship capable of engagement had been developed from the principles in the foundational text and field-tested in the smaller conflicts that had punctuated the preceding years. The Valley of Tombs had been reinforced beyond its original specifications, on the quiet understanding that the repositories needed to survive whatever came regardless of whether the surface above them did. She had not recommended a strategy for winning. She had recommended a strategy for lasting long enough to matter. Voron Kaas had commanded Jedi-led military operations for 19 years before the fleet assembled for the Unknown Regions campaign. He was 57. His record was considered exemplary, not flashy, Not the kind of command history that produced famous stories, but consistent. He had a reputation for accurate assessment of situation that others were inclined to misread through optimism or urgency, and for making decisions that preserved more lives than the alternative decisions would have, while still achieving the operational objective. The masters who selected him for this command had done so because they wanted someone who would not be excited by what he found. They were right to think about it that way. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace above Korriban on a morning in the valley's wet season. The brief annual period when the temperature differential between the surface and the upper atmosphere produced cloud cover and occasional precipitation across the northern terrain. The planet below was partially obscured when the forward sensors began returning readings. What the readings showed took the navigation staff approximately 4 minutes to fully process, because the first pass suggested an error and the second pass confirmed that the first pass had been accurate. The Sith had a fleet, not a large one by Republic standards, 47 vessels, ranging from heavy transports converted for engagement to purpose-built craft whose design bore no resemblance to anything in the Republic's recognition database, but present, formed, already moving into a defensive configuration that indicated they had known the Republic was coming long enough to plan for the specific approach vectors a fleet of this size would use. Voron Cass looked at the tactical display for a long moment and then asked his senior staff 2 questions. The first was how long they estimated the Sith had known. The second was whether anyone in the briefing materials they had been given before departure had addressed this possibility. The answer to the first question was uncertain. At minimum weeks, possibly months. The answer to the second question was no. He made a note in his personal log that evening. We were told we were going to find scattered survivors of an exile from a century ago. What we found was a civilization that had been preparing for us. Someone failed to ask the right questions before we left. I do not know yet what that costs us. I expect to find out. The first 2 years of the engagement were not what either side had expected. The Sith fought with a capability that the Republic fleet's tactical models had not included, because the tactical models had been built on the assumption that a century of isolation in the unknown regions would have degraded the exiles' military capacity. The assumption was wrong in the specific way that assumptions about isolated communities are often wrong. It had treated isolation as deprivation, when the reality had been development along lines the Republic had not considered. The alchemical constructs performed exactly as Sorza's Sin specifications had predicted. Against individual Jedi in single ship engagements, they were effective enough to produce results that the Republic fleet's command staff found deeply uncomfortable to report. The hardened hulls absorbed energy discharge at rates that standard Republic weapons could not consistently overcome at normal engagement distances. The Sith won 11 of the first 14 engagements. Voron Cass did not change his manner during this period. He remained what he had always been in operational contexts: precise, unhurried, focused on information over reaction. What he did was study. He spent the first 8 months of the campaign learning the Sith engagement patterns with the same systematic attention that Sorza's Sin had applied to codifying the alchemical arts, looking for the load-bearing principles underneath the specific tactics. What was the thing that made the constructs effective? What was the thing that the hardened hulls were actually protecting against? What was the logic of the defensive formation the Sith fleet consistently returned to after each engagement? He found the answer in the 14th month, watching two Jedi Masters attempt to coordinate their force application against a construct cluster, and failing because they were each working from their own internal sense of timing rather than a shared one. The Sith methods assumed individual practitioners. The constructs were designed to counter the capabilities of a single Jedi working alone, or at most in pairs who had trained together long enough to have an informal synchronization. What the methods had no counter for was a group of masters who had agreed in advance on a precise coordination protocol, a shared rhythm, externally established, that allowed multiple practitioners to apply force pressure to the same target at the same moment with the same intensity. He spent 3 weeks developing the protocol with the 6 masters present in the fleet. It required a kind of ego setting aside that he had not been certain all 6 would manage. All 6 managed it. He noted this in his log without comment. The 15th engagement went differently. The 16th went worse for the Sith than the 15th. By the 20th, the tactical balance had shifted in a direction it did not shift back from. Ajunta Pal was 91 years old when the long approach finally arrived. His body had followed the trajectory of human bodies across 9 decades, diminished in the ways that time diminished physical capacity, maintained in other ways by the force techniques that the alchemical arts had developed for exactly this purpose. He moved slowly. He tired in the evenings. His vision had narrowed at the edges. What had not diminished was the quality of his attention. He followed the engagement reports with the same precision he had brought to everything across his life. The hearing in the council chamber, the address to the fleet on the 9th day of the crossing, the 11-minute meeting with Karness Moore. He had known the Republic would come. He had known it for decades. What he had not allowed himself to fully examine in the years of preparation and anticipation was what he actually wanted the outcome to be. He wanted Korriban to survive. He wanted the repositories to hold. He wanted the knowledge accumulated across a century, the alchemical principles, the techniques, the first holocron, Reth's archive, the chronicler's record, to outlast whatever the Republic brought with it. He did not know, examining this honestly in his 91st year, whether he wanted the people to survive in the same way, not because he had stopped caring about the people, but because the people were already something he had not intended them to become, shaped by the codification Sorza's sin had produced and the internal war that had preceded it, and 60 years of building a civilization on a foundation of power that had slowly stopped questioning itself. He had built this. He understood that he had built it. The understanding did not feel like pride. When the reports from the 20th engagement reached him, he read them and set them down and sat for a while in the room that had been his for 60 years, the same room where Karness Moore had laid out his organic transmutation research on the table, where the chronicler had sat in the corner recording what was said. The room was quieter now. The chronicler was dead, 3 years gone, her records preserved in the archive she had spent her life filling. He thought about the question she had noted in her first entry about him on the 9th day of the crossing. He did not tell them not to be afraid. He did not tell them everything would be fine. He told them what was true and what was being worked on and what was unknown. He was still doing that. What was true was that the campaign was lost. What was being worked on was the survival of the repositories. What was unknown was whether that survival would be enough to constitute a continuation. Sorzu Sin managed the remaining fleet engagements from the command position she had held since the campaign began, with the particular quality of composure that came not from certainty of outcome, but from having eliminated surprise as a possible response. She had written the document 12 years ago. She had described this. She had not described it as victory. She had described it as lasting long enough to matter. She lasted. The fleet was reduced over the following year from 47 vessels to 19, then to 11, then to 4. The 4 surviving ships were not capable of sustained engagement. She directed them toward the outer system on routes that avoided the Republic fleet's established patrol patterns, and told their commanders to keep moving and not return until the situation on the surface had resolved in one direction or the other. She remained on Korriban. Her presence on the surface was required for the repository reinforcement procedures she was still completing. This was true. It was also true that leaving felt, to her, like a more complete defeat than staying. Voron Kaas made planetfall on a morning 16 days after the last Sith fleet engagement. His ground forces moved through the Valley City's outer structures with the systematic thoroughness of people who had been told to leave nothing active and had decided to interpret that instruction broadly. The constructs that remained, those not destroyed in the orbital engagements, were located and dismantled. The alchemical weapon systems were identified and deactivated. The Valley of Tombs was reached on the 3rd day of the ground operation. Voron Kaas walked into it himself. He had made a practice across 19 years of command of going personally to the places where the significant things were, rather than reading about them in reports. The valley was narrower than he had expected from the survey imagery. A deep cut in the rock face, the walls rising on both sides to heights that made the strip of sky above them look like something poured between two surfaces rather than actual sky. The repository structures were set into the walls at intervals, each sealed with a closure that his force senses could feel even before his hands confirmed it. He moved through the valley counting structures. 7, 8. Deeper, in the section where the rock face curved slightly and the acoustics changed, a 9th. He stood in front of the 9th structure for a moment. The door was the same carved stone as the others. The inscription above it used a word he did not recognize in any language he had studied. He made a note of it for the archive staff to address. The stone above the door was warm. He put his hand against it. The warmth had no obvious source. The temperature in the valley's deep section was lower than the surface, not higher. He noted this in his field record and moved on. He had a campaign to close. The warmth was a question for someone else. Inside the city's central structures, his forces had found what the survey had not prepared them for: a functioning archive, rooms full of documents in multiple languages, material organized with the care of something built to last rather than to hide. He ordered it preserved and catalogued. He did not order it destroyed, which was a decision he made without consulting the council members present, and which he was aware they would raise questions about when he returned to Coruscant. He made the decision because destroying an archive felt, to him, like the same kind of answer the council had given a century ago in that chamber, the one that had produced everything he was now standing in the middle of. He was tired. He was 59 years old, and tired in the specific way that comes not from physical exertion, but from spending years doing something that was necessary and correct, and also, in some way he could not fully articulate in official language, incomplete. The 9th repository had no occupant that his forces could confirm. The door held against every standard method of entry. He ordered it sealed from the exterior, an additional closure over the one already present, and left it as he had found it. Ajuntapal had walked into it 4 days before the ground forces arrived. He had come alone, in the early morning, when the valley was still in shadow. He had sat in the entrance passage for a while before going deeper, which was why the stone above the door was still warm when Voran Cass put his hand against it 4 days later. He had not brought anything with him. He had left the room that had been his for 60 years exactly as it was. The table, the lamp, the records he had kept in his own hand across 9 decades. He had walked out of the city and into the valley and entered the deepest structure and gone as far in as the passage allowed and sat down with his back against the carved wall. The force in the stone was very old, older than the exile, older than the Sith civilization the High Priest's people had built over millennia. Something in the planet itself held it, the way certain materials hold heat, not generating it, simply refusing to release what had been given to them. He closed his eyes. The passage was quiet. The question he had asked in the council chamber in 7003 BBY, the one about what right meant, the one Karnas Moore had picked up on the crossing ship and carried forward into a war, was still there, still unfinished. He had not answered it. He had built a civilization and conducted a war and lost both, and the question was exactly as open as it had been when the Togrutan woman's voice had told the recorder that the hearing was concluded. He had one more thing to do before the stone became permanent around him. One act that required less strength than he had left, but more intention than most of what remained to him. He reached into the Force the way he had learned to reach at the age of 13 in a temple that no longer held his name. And he did the thing that would keep the stone above the entrance warm for as long as the structure held. Not as a signal, not as a message, as a question left in the only medium that did not require words. Something in this stone does not settle. Come and find out why. The formal acknowledgement took place in the Senate rotunda on a morning when the upper levels of Coruscant were clear enough to let actual sunlight reach the building's exterior for the first time in several weeks. Voran Cass stood at the designated position on the floor of the rotunda and delivered his operational summary in the measured, precise cadence that had characterized every report he had ever submitted: engagement counts, casualty figures, disposition of recovered materials, status of the remaining ground operation. The summary took 14 minutes. The senators present listened with the particular quality of attention that political bodies give to military success. Satisfied, already moving mentally toward the next thing, grateful that the details were being handled by someone else. The council members present were more attentive. One of them, a Sarian master whose name Voran Cass had known for 20 years, held his gaze for a moment at the end of the summary and gave a single nod that carried more weight than anything said aloud in the rotunda that morning. Voran Cass returned the nod. He collected his materials. He walked out of the rotunda into a corridor that smelled of recycled air and floor polish, and he stood there for a moment with his hand against the wall and his eyes focused on nothing in particular. He was 59 years old. He had commanded the largest military operation the Jedi Order had undertaken in living memory. He had won it. The Senate had just acknowledged this in formal session, which meant it was now part of the Republic's official record, a fact, settled, available to any future scholar who wanted to confirm that the conflict had occurred and had been resolved in the Republic's favor. He felt none of what he had expected to feel in this corridor. He had expected, if not celebration. Then, at least, the particular relief that came at the end of a sustained effort, the release of something that had been held tightly for a long time. What he felt instead was a kind of flatness, not depression, not grief, a flatness, as if the rotunda's official acknowledgement had processed the event into a category that had nothing to do with what the event had actually been. He pushed off the wall and walked toward the transport bay. He had a second phase to oversee. Riva Noor had been on Korriban for 11 months by the time the first phase withdrew. She was 28. She had been a Jedi Knight for 3 years, elevated 6 months before the campaign assembled, which meant that the Unknown Regions operation was the first sustained engagement of her career as a fully credentialed practitioner. She had been good at it. Her commanders had noted this in assessments that used words like instinctive and decisive, which in military contexts meant that she made correct choices faster than the situation seemed to allow for. She did not feel instinctive or decisive. She felt like someone who had spent 11 months doing things she had not been prepared for and was now being asked to continue doing them in a quieter register, which was in some ways harder than the active engagement had been. The second phase of the operation involved 4 primary tasks: systematic survey of all structures in and around the Valley City, cataloging of any materials recovered during the survey, physical sealing of the repository structures in the Valley of Tombs, and confirmation that no functioning Sith presence remained in any surveyed location. The tasks were procedural. They had clear endpoints. She had been assigned to lead the tomb sealing component because her commander had assessed her as someone who could be trusted to work carefully in conditions that were difficult to characterize. The valley's specific atmospheric quality, the way the Force moved through the carved stone differently than it moved through open air, the repositories themselves with their alchemical reinforcement pressing against her awareness, like something insisting on being noticed. She sealed the first 6 structures without incident over the course of 3 days. Each one was the same procedure: exterior assessment, force, that no living presence was inside, physical closure applied over whatever sealing already existed, notation in the field record. The notation included location, structural condition, and any anomalous readings. The first 6 produced no anomalous readings. The 7th produced one. She was moving the closure mechanism into position when the Force gave her a sensation she had learned, across 11 months, to associate with the presence of something recently significant. Not an active presence, not a living one, but the residue of an intensity that had not fully dissipated. The way a room holds the temperature of a fire after the fire has been out for hours. She confirmed no living presence. She completed the closure. She notated the anomalous reading without being able to characterize it more specifically than residual force concentration, elevated, cause undetermined. She moved to the 8th structure, then the 9th. The 9th was the deepest. She had been told by the survey team that it was also the most recently constructed. Assessment based on the relative freshness of the carved surfaces compared to the others, which showed more weathering despite the protected location. She stood in front of it and ran her standard assessment and confirmed what the survey had found: no living presence. The closure was already substantial, more thorough than any of the others, a layered ceiling that had required more than one practitioner to establish. She added the exterior closure over it and stepped back. The stone above the door was warm. She put her hand against it the way Voron Cass had, 4 days before the ground forces arrived, and 10 months before she was standing in this same spot. The warmth was the same, sourceless, steady, unconnected to the valley's ambient temperature. She held her hand there for a moment longer than the assessment required. Then she withdrew it and made the notation. Anomalous thermal reading, entrance stone, no mechanical or geological source identified. Suggest follow-up assessment by specialist staff. She walked out of the valley. The notation went into the field record. Nobody followed up. The being she had killed was named. The chronicler's records later confirmed Doss, a male human, approximately 40 years old, who had been part of the Sith community for his entire life. Born on Korriban to parents who had made the crossing as young adults. He had no memory of Coruscant. He had no personal connection to the Jedi Order or the philosophical dispute that had produced the exile. He was, in the most direct sense available, a product of the civilization that the exile had created, rather than a member of the generation that had chosen it. He had been located in a structure on the eastern edge of the residential quarter during the 3rd week of the ground operation, in a room that the survey team had initially assessed as unoccupied. He was not armed when Reva Nor entered. He was seated against the far wall with his hands visible at his sides, a posture that, in the context of an active military operation, carried a clear meaning. Not a threat, not a combatant. Someone waiting to be found and processed according to whatever procedure the finding party had for the found. She had been in the room for approximately 4 seconds when it happened. She did not plan it. She did not feel anger in the moment, or fear, or any of the states she might have pointed to afterward as explanation. She felt something that had no name, a pressure that originated not in the situation in front of her, but somewhere beneath the 11 months of the campaign, beneath the instinctive and decisive assessments that her commanders had noted, beneath the layer of her that had been functioning correctly and efficiently, and in accordance with everything her training had prepared her to do. The pressure moved. The action followed it. It lasted less than 2 seconds. She stood in the room afterward with Doss on the floor and her hands at her sides. The posture was almost identical to his had been. She registered this without being able to do anything useful with the registration. She did not report it. This was the only deliberate choice in the sequence. The moment before, during, and immediately after had not involved deliberation in any form she recognized. The decision not to report was deliberate. She made it in the 4 seconds following the action, standing in the room, and she made it without any clear reasoning she could have articulated. It felt less like a choice to conceal and more like the recognition that there was no category in the reporting system for what had just happened. She had not been threatened. There had been no tactical necessity. The forms available to her required a justification from a list of defined justifications. None of the items on the list were applicable. She left the room. She completed her shift. She ate an evening meal with 3 colleagues who described her as quieter than usual, which she did not dispute. In the weeks that followed, she catalogued alchemical texts for the Destruction Order, a task she performed with the same care she brought to everything, reading enough of each document to confirm its category before adding it to the relevant pile. Several of the texts she catalogued were sections of the foundational document Sorza Sin had produced, the systematic codification of the alchemical arts, written in clear language that a careful reader could follow. She read portions of it with more attention than the cataloging task required. She did not take any of it. She did not hide any of it. She catalogued every piece exactly as the procedure specified and submitted her records at the end of each day, and went to sleep and woke up and did it again. What she was looking for in the texts, she did not fully understand this until much later, years after she had returned to Coruscant and resumed the career that her unknown region's record had positioned well, was an explanation for the pressure, the thing that had moved before the action. She had been raised and trained in an institution that taught that the Force was a guide toward right action and that practitioners who listened carefully would be directed away from harm. What she was looking for was the category that covered the situation where the guidance and the harm had been, for a period of less than 2 seconds, the same direction. She did not find it in the texts. The texts were about construction and modification and the directed application of power toward specific outcomes. They were not interested in the question she was asking. Voron Kaas returned to Korriban for a final inspection 3 months after the Senate Rotunda appearance. He walked through the Valley City with Reva Nor as his operational guide, moving through the catalogued spaces and the cleared structures and the sealed repositories in the Valley of Tombs. She showed him the field records for each location. He read them with his characteristic precision. At the 9th repository, he stopped. He read her notation about the thermal anomaly. He looked at the stone above the door for a moment. "You recommended specialist follow-up," he said. "Yes. Has anyone been assigned?" "Not yet." He looked at the door for another moment. Then he said, "Note in the updated record that the anomaly was assessed and determined to be a geological characteristic of this specific section of the valley. Wall. No further follow-up required." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the inscription above the door, the word in the Sith species language that neither of them could read. "Why?" she asked. "Because I have read enough of the archive to know that whatever is in this structure was already inside it before our fleet arrived," he said. "And because I think the question of what to do with things that are already finished is different from the question of what to do with things that are still active. This one is finished." He was not certain this was true. He said it anyway, in the same tone he used for the things he was certain of, and the distinction was not visible from the outside. They walked out of the valley together without speaking further. Dresh was 53 years old, which made him old enough to remember the internal war as a child's memory. The sounds from the valley, the adults speaking in lowered voices, the way the ordinary texture of daily life had developed a specific quality of uncertainty that persisted for 6 years and then gradually released. His grandfather had told him the story of the original arrival when he was 8. The fleet from beyond the edge of the sky. The beings who descended from the ships and were received by the high priest with the gesture that meant the presence of something beyond the current framework for understanding. His grandfather had been 12 when this happened. He had watched from the hillside above the eastern residential quarter, which offered a clear sightline to the landing area. His grandfather had said, "They were not the gods the traditions described. I do not know what they were. Something that did not have a name we owned." Dresh had grown up with this observation, the way children grow up with the foundational stories of their families. Present, partially understood, shaping the angle from which he saw subsequent events without being something he thought about consciously most of the time. He had watched the Republic fleet arrive from the same hillside. He had watched the ground operation move through the city below. He had watched the Valley of Tombs visited and sealed and noted in records that would be carried away to a place he would never see. He had watched the cataloging teams move through the archive building, where Reth had spent 48 years writing, and he had not known whether the materials inside were preserved or destroyed, because from the hillside the difference was not visible. He watched the final withdrawal from the same position. The ships ascending in sequence, the smaller craft first, and then the larger ones. The formation assembling in the upper atmosphere and holding briefly before the jump. The sky over the valley was clear that day, one of the dry season days when the temperature differential had settled and the dust had not yet been stirred by afternoon wind. The ships were visible until they were not. The valley city below him was not empty. His people were still there. The Sith species population that had occupied this planet for millennia before the exile fleet arrived, and that remained after the Republic fleet departed, diminished, materially altered by a century of a civilization that had been built on top of and around and through the existing one, but present. He sat on the hillside for a while after the last ship disappeared. The valley was quiet in the way that places become quiet after extended noise. Not the quiet of a place that has always been still, but the quiet of a place that has registered the absence of something. His grandfather had said they were not gods. They were not. His grandfather had not known what they were. Dresh had lived inside the civilization they built for 53 years, and he still did not have a better answer than his grandfather had managed at 12, watching from this same hillside. The galaxy had words for many things: conquerors, exiles, builders, teachers, enemies. The beings who had come and built and fought and been driven away and left their sealed repositories in the valley wall. None of those words covered them completely. None of those words covered what they had left behind in the stone, either. Somewhere below the horizon, moving away at speeds his grandfather's generation had not possessed the framework to conceive of. The ones who had survived the Republic's operation were still moving. Where they had gone, nobody on this hillside knew. Whether they carried the question Veth had taken into the desert with them, or whether they had left it behind with everything else, was not something that could be determined from a hillside above the valley. Dresh stayed until the light began to shift. Then he went back down. The moon had no name in any Republic catalog. This was not unusual. The unknown regions held more unnamed bodies than named ones, a ratio that reflected the limits of Republic exploration rather than any scarcity of things worth naming. The moon orbited a gas giant that itself appeared in only one survey record, logged by an automated probe some decades before the exile and never followed up. It was rocky, cold at the poles and temperate at the equator, with an atmosphere thin enough to require supplement in outdoor conditions, but sufficient to support enclosed habitation, without the kind of mechanical complexity that left detectable energy signatures at long range. Sorzus Sin had identified it during the 4 months between the final Sith fleet engagements and the Republic ground operation. She had used the time the way she used every resource available to her, completely, without waste, directed toward the specific outcome she had determined was achievable given the constraints. Total victory was not achievable. Continuation was. She had oriented every decision across those 4 months toward continuation. 4 people made it to the moon with her. 3 were practitioners whose capabilities she had assessed as worth preserving, not the most powerful members of the remaining community, which would have been her own preference. but the ones whose specific skills complemented the gaps in what she carried. The fourth was a 17-year-old whose parents had been killed in the 23rd engagement and who had attached himself to her evacuation group with the particular tenacity of someone who has lost everything stationary and has decided that movement is the only remaining option. She had considered leaving him at the departure point. She had brought him instead, for a reason she did not articulate at the time and only partially examined afterward. He was force-sensitive at a level she had not encountered in a student since her own training under the older exile community. His raw capacity was not yet directed by anything systematic. He was, in the language of her codification, unwritten, a surface that had not yet received its inscription. She named him Tulak on the third day after their arrival on the moon, when she had assessed him thoroughly enough to be certain of what she was working with. In the Sith species language that the exile community had partially absorbed across a century of habitation on Korriban, the word meant the vessel, something shaped specifically to hold and carry a content larger than the container appeared able to manage. He accepted the name without asking what it meant. She did not volunteer the translation. The facility they built was underground, which was both a practical decision and a philosophical one. Practically, subsurface construction minimized the thermal and electromagnetic signatures that long-range Republic detection equipment was calibrated to identify. The moon's geological composition provided natural shielding against the specific sensor types that had been used during the Unknown Regions campaign. Below 3 meters of rock, they were effectively invisible to anything not in direct orbital proximity, with detailed scanning equipment deployed specifically toward their location. Philosophically, building downward felt correct in a way that Sorza Sin noted in her private record, without fully analyzing. The Valley of Tombs on Korriban had been carved into the face of stone. The repositories had been pressed into the rock rather than constructed on its surface. There was something in that orientation, going into the material rather than sitting on top of it, that aligned with the directional logic of the Sith arts. You did not stand apart from the thing you were working with. You entered it. You understood its structure from the inside. The facility took 8 months to complete to a functional standard. During those 8 months, the 4 adults conducted the construction work in rotation, while the remaining time was given to 2 activities: training Tulak and recovering the content of the holocrons they had evacuated. The holocrons required careful handling. Sorza Sin had produced the first one herself in the years before the war, and she understood its architecture precisely. The others, 6 additional devices representing the accumulated knowledge of practitioners who were now dead or dispersed, had been produced by people whose specific methods of encoding she had to reverse engineer from the devices themselves. This took time. It took more concentration than the construction work, which had the advantage of being physical and therefore legible. The holocrons were legible only to someone who understood the force architecture underlying their storage system. And Sorza Sin was, at this point, one of perhaps 4 beings in the galaxy who qualified. She recovered all 6. The content was intact. She added it to the teaching sequence she was assembling for Tulak and the 3 other practitioners. A structured curriculum that moved from foundational principles through applied technique, organized in the same systematic manner as the codification she had produced on Korriban. No ambiguity in the sequencing. No space left for a student to conclude that the order of instruction was arbitrary and therefore optional. She had learned, producing the original codification, that the organization of knowledge was not neutral. The order in which ideas were presented determined which ideas felt foundational and which felt supplementary. She had made specific choices in the original document about what came first. She made the same choices in the curriculum with greater precision because she now had 8 years of evidence about what those choices produced in students and could calibrate accordingly. Tulak practiced in the lower chamber of the facility, which was the largest space available, and the one with the most consistent temperature. A quality that mattered for certain categories of alchemical work, where environmental fluctuation introduced variables that complicated result assessment. He practiced for 6 to 8 hours each day, not because Sorza's sin required this duration. Her instruction schedule accounted for 4 hours of formal teaching and left the remainder of the day unstructured. He filled the unstructured time with practice because, as best she could determine from observation, the alternative did not interest him. Rest was something his body required at intervals. Everything between those intervals was available for work. She watched him from the upper observation position, a shelf cut into the chamber wall that allowed a clear sight line to the practice floor without requiring physical presence in the space. She had established the habit of watching him from this position in the 3rd month of training, when it had become clear that her presence on the floor during his unstructured practice altered what he did. With her watching from above, he worked as he would have worked alone. She found this more informative than the formal sessions. What she observed was a practitioner developing without the friction that had characterized every student she had previously encountered. Friction, in her experience of teaching, was the product of a student's existing framework encountering new information that did not fit neatly into it. The friction was often productive. It was where the interesting questions came from, where a student's individual understanding showed itself in the specific shape of their resistance. But it slowed development. The student had to integrate new material against the pressure of what they already believed, and that integration took time and effort that could not be directed toward the material itself. Tulak had no existing framework to generate friction. He had grown up in the Valley City during the decade before the war, in a community that had already absorbed the codified doctrine as the baseline description of reality. He had not been taught to question whether the force could be directed toward the restructuring of matter. He had grown up in a place where this happened routinely, where the evidence of it was in the agricultural terraces and the treatment halls and the constructs that moved through the residential quarter on assigned tasks. His relationship to the Sith arts was not the relationship of someone who had been persuaded of something. It was the relationship of someone who had been born knowing it. She wrote in her private record, in the 5th year of their time on the moon, he is more capable than I was at his age by a margin that I find difficult to estimate precisely because our starting conditions were so different. I was rebuilding something I had been told not to build. Every technique I developed required me to work against the habit of restraint that the Order had installed in me over 11 years of training. He is installing nothing. He is only building. The difference in velocity is not surprising. The depth of it is, she added. Below this, he frightens me. She did not write why. She had the reason in her mind clearly enough. It was not an unclear thought that required the discipline of articulation to resolve. She chose not to record it, which was a different kind of decision. The private record had always been the place where she wrote what she actually thought, rather than what was useful for others to know. The choice not to record a thought was, in the context of that record, itself a significant act. What she did not write was this: Ajunta Pal had been frightening in a way she had understood. His authority had been legible, grounded in specific capabilities, specific knowledge, specific choices made across decades that she had been present for and could evaluate. You could disagree with Ajunta Pal's conclusions and still trace the path by which he had reached them. The disagreement was possible because the path was visible. Tulak's development had no visible path of that kind. He was not making choices that she could evaluate against alternatives he had considered and rejected. He was moving in a single direction with the assurance of someone who does not know that other directions exist. That assurance was not arrogance. She had worked with arrogance and recognized its texture. It was something quieter and more complete. The confidence of a river, which does not choose its direction, but simply moves in the only way available to it and carries everything in its path. A river could be redirected. She was not certain Tulak could. In the 6th year, the texts that had belonged to Karnas Moor resurfaced. Not the man himself. There had been no confirmed contact with Moor or any faction associated with him since his departure from Korriban before the war's end. What resurfaced were copies. One of the 3 practitioners who had evacuated with Sorza's Sin had, during the chaotic period immediately preceding departure, gathered whatever documents were accessible in the northern compound area. Among them, mixed into a collection of technical records that had not been carefully sorted, were several pages of notation in Moor's characteristic compressed style. The practitioner who found them brought them to Sorza's Sin. She read them carefully. They covered sections of the autonomous construct, research, the methodology she had known about during the war, and the foundational principles she had not, because Moore had kept those in the mental space behind his eyes rather than in any document that the formal archive held. She set them aside for 3 days. On the 4th day, she brought them to Tulak. She did not tell him who had written them. She did not tell him that the techniques described had been prohibited by the founding generation. She presented them as recovered material from the pre-war period, which was accurate, and asked him to read and assess whether the methodology was consistent with the foundational principles he had been taught. He read them in a single session. His assessment was delivered the following morning, precise and organized and entirely free of the historical weight she had decided not to provide. He said the methodology was consistent with foundational principles and represented a significant extension of what the curriculum had covered in the relevant application areas. He said he would like to explore it further if she considered the material worth developing. She said she would consider it. She wrote in her private record that evening, Moore spent years developing what is in those pages, against the prohibition of someone who understood what it would produce. Tulak read it in an afternoon and assessed it correctly on the first pass. The prohibition no longer exists. The person who issued it is in a sealed repository on a planet several systems from here, holding something warm in stone that I will not see again. What Moore was trying to argue, that the constructs were the direction the arts were, already moving, and that refusing them was refusing the logic of the thing itself, is now simply true. Not because he won the argument, because everyone who held the other position is gone. I am 73 years old. My body has begun the process that bodies begin at this age, and my practice can slow it, but not prevent it. I have perhaps 2 more years of full capacity. After that, a decline of indeterminate duration. What I have built here will not decline with me. Tuluk will carry it past whatever I was capable of, in directions I have not predicted, without the weight of doubt that every member of my generation carried, and that I transmitted to the codification and the curriculum without intending to. I thought I had removed the doubt. I systematized around it. What I actually did was build a container for it, a structure that acknowledged its own certainty so clearly that anyone reading it would assume the certainty was earned rather than decided. He will not assume, he will simply proceed. I find that I am at peace with this. I am also frightened by it. I have held both of these responses for 2 years and have not found that one resolves the other. They are both true simultaneously. I do not know what to do with that except write it down and leave it here. She died on the last night of the 8th year in the lower chamber where Tulak practiced. She had gone there deliberately at an hour when the facility was otherwise quiet. She sat on the floor with her back against the chamber wall, the same posture Ajunta Pal had taken in the repository on Korriban. Though she did not know this, she did not know the position of his body when the door had been sealed. She had not been present. She had been directing the evacuation from the outer edge of the city, watching the Valley of Tombs from a distance, unable to count the specific entrance he had chosen. The method she used was the one described in the codification she had written. The section on the termination of physical function through deliberate force application, which she had included because the doctrine required an honest account of what the force made possible, including in the area of one's own continuation. The section had been precise and clinical, written in the same register as the sections on alchemical technique. She had not added any philosophical framing to it. She had not needed to. The doctrine's position on the matter was clear. A practitioner retained authority over the conditions of their own ending, as over everything else within their capacity to control. She controlled it. It took less than 10 minutes. Tulak found her in the morning. He stood in the entrance to the lower chamber for a moment, looking at what was there, and then he walked forward and crouched beside her and placed 2 fingers against the floor near her hand. He remained in that position for approximately 3 minutes. What he was doing during those 3 minutes was not grief. Exactly. He had not been taught to categorize that specific response, and his relationship to the Sith arts did not include a formal account of what a practitioner was supposed to feel when the person who had shaped them was no longer present. What he was doing was closer to assessment, taking in the fact of the situation, determining what it required. What it required was continuation. He stood. He went to the teaching records and began organizing what needed to be organized. By midday, the curriculum materials were inventoried. By evening, he had identified 2 sections that would need expansion, given that he was now the most senior practitioner in the facility and would need to teach what he had previously only learned. He did not leave the moon immediately. There were things to finish first. Sorza's sin had left things unfinished, not through oversight, but because she had understood the pace of her own decline well enough to know which projects would require more time than she had, and had organized accordingly, leaving clear notation on what remained and what the next stage of each would involve. He followed the notation. He was methodical in the way she had made him. The facility hummed around him with the sound of systems she had designed, and he now maintained. Outside, above the rock ceiling, the unnamed moon turned in its orbit around the unnamed gas giant, which moved through its slow arc around a star that appeared in one survey record and had been logged and not followed up. The Republic did not find them. Nobody was looking in the right direction. The campaign had been concluded. The archive on Korriban was being processed. The sealed repositories were noted in field records that were being transferred to the central catalog on Coruscant, where they would be shelved under a conflict designation and accessed over the following centuries by a diminishing number of researchers with diminishing reasons to look. Sorza Sin had built something that survived her. She had known it would. She had spent 8 years on an unnamed moon making certain of it, and the certainty had held. What she had not been certain of, what she had written around in the private record without writing directly, was what it meant that the thing surviving her was also the thing that frightened her. Whether those two facts were contradictory, or whether they were, as she had begun to suspect in her final years, simply the same fact described from two different positions. She had not resolved it. She had left it in the record, unresolved, for whoever came later with the patience to read carefully. Nobody who read it later found the resolution either. The question was still open. It always had been.